So let us look at the stomach. In order to understand the stomach, it's important to know the location of the stomach. So if you look at the skeleton right here, you can see that the viscera of the abdomen is divided into locations. Their locations are divided on the basis of imaginary lines. So the location is divided by two lines that are drawn below the chondrus or the ribs, and then we have a line that connects the pubic bones or the iliac crest of the pubic region. So those two lines, and then we have another two imaginary lines that run perpendicular to them. So the location of the stomach according to these lines lie in the upper quadrant. So the left upper quadrant in order to be more precise. So the regions of the left upper quadrant which are occupied by the stomach include the left hypochondrium, then we have the epigastrium region, and lastly we have the umbilical region. Now that we have now we have a fair enough grasp on the location of the stomach. The stomach is also in relation to a few organs, namely the esophagus and the duodenum. The esophagus is located on the superior aspect, and the duodenum is located in the inferior aspect. Then, it is important to note that in babies, the capacity of the stomach is about 20 to 30 milliliters. However, in the case of adults, it's much more, ranging from between 1,000 to 1,500 milliliters. The stomach is also divided into parts. The first part is known as the fundus. Then we have the body. Then we have the pyloric antrum of the stomach. Then we have the pyloric canal. Then we have the pylorus. And lastly, the duodenum. So now it's also important to know that this small part right here, is also known as the cardiac region, and this actual fundus extends from the cardiac region, goes towards the body, and the body is an integral. There is a point at which there is an angle that is found on the stomach known as the angular incisure. So this is known as the angular incisure. Now let us take a look on the anterosuperior surface of the stomach. Anterosuperiorly, the first structure that we can see that covers most of the anterosuperior side of the stomach is known as the peritoneum. Then we have superiorly the diaphragm. The diaphragm acts as an obstruction and then prevents the touching of the lungs and the pleura of the lungs with the superior and the anterosuperior surface of the stomach. Next thing that we can see is the lateral and the medial relation of the stomach. The lateral relation of the stomach, laterally towards the left, we have the relation with the upper left visceral surface of the spleen. And then on the right side, we have a relation with the lobe of the liver. Now this area is especially important because you can see that there is a certain entity known as the gastrotomy tube. The insertion of a gastrotomy tube takes place here. So now let us look at the posterior surface of the stomach. So just like previously how we divided the anterior surface into anterosuperior, anterolateral, anteromedial, we are going to divide this surface into parts like that too. So the posterior surface superiorly is covered with the help of the peritoneum, except a small pedicular region known as the bare area of the stomach, which is near the cardiac part of the stomach. But that was the posterior superior portion. Let us now consider the posterior inferior part. The posterior inferior part is made up of a lot of organs. So the first entity that you can notice here is the fact that it's not really here per se, because it's the crus of the diaphragm. So the stomach, the posterior, it lies at near the crus of the diaphragm, which lies somewhere like this. And then we have the inferior phrenic vessel. So the structure in green right here is known as the inferior phrenic vessels. The stomach is also in relation with the suprarenal gland of the left kidney, and also the left kidney, especially the anterior aspect of the left kidney. Then we have parts of the pancreas that also make up the posterior inferior relation of the stomach, and then lastly we have the mesocolon. So the transverse mesocolon, the superior portion of the transverse mesocolon makes up the posterior inferior relation or the surface of the stomach. Let us take a look at the gastric sphincters. Now we're going to be learning about two sphincters, the cardiac sphincter and the pyloric sphincter. The cardiac sphincter is found at approximately the 11th thoracic vertebrae and is approximately 40 centimeters away from the incisor of the tooth. Then, if you notice, there is a certain significant difference between the mucosa of the sphincter, where the sphincter starts, and the esophagus ends. And you can see the difference in the mucosa because esophageal mucosa is much more pink and the cardiac mucosa is much more reddish in color. Another thing that you can notice is that the esophageal mucosa is made up of flattened squamous tissues, and then it is separated from the cardiac or the gastric mucosa with the help of a zigzag line. And then you can notice that there is the presence of columnar epithelia when it comes to the cardiac mucosa. Now let us look at the other sphincter, the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter too has a distinct mucosa. Its mucosa consists of longitudinal muscles, and then we have circular muscles that are separated by septas. Okay, so I want you to look at this image right here. This image is basically the determination of the the changes in the gastric mucosa during an endoscopic examination. So as you can see, we are observing the cardiac region, which is somewhere here. Then we have the greater curvature in the body of the stomach, the region that is somewhere here. And then we have the pyloric antrum, the region about here. And then we have the prepyloric antrum near the pyloric canal, that is somewhere here. So in this way, we are observing four different regions of the stomach, inside the stomach. The rugae, like at rest, normally at rest, the stomach is usually filled with gas. However, it's just not filled with gas, but also the sphincters are closed. So there are two sphincters, two main sphincters, the cardiac one, the cardiac sphincter, and then we have the pyloric sphincter. And both of them, so this pyloric sphincter right here, as you can see, are closed, and the cardiac sphincter right here are closed. But then there's also a difference in the rugae or the roughage inside the stomach. So the first thing we can see in the cardiac, we can see that there are some megastraes or folds, mucosal folds, and these mucosal folds usually are more profound and defined when it comes to the greater curvature, this region right here, which is the greater curvature. Not so much near the lesser curvature because the lesser curvature leads to the canal, and near the canal there's normally a distension which leads to a much more cobblestone-like appearances, and then which usually then becomes a bit more smoother as we go into the pyloric canal. And then lastly, we have the prepyloric antrum, which is also smoother as comparison to the rest of the rugae, and the canal or the sphincter in the end is usually closed, so closed. Let us understand about the gastric supply of the stomach. The gastric supply is supplied majorly by a branch of the abdominal aorta known as the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk is divided into three parts: the left gastric, splenic, and common hepatic. Here where we're going to be concentrating on the left gastric artery and the splenic artery. The splenic artery is further divided into many branches, namely the left gastroemental or the gastroepiploic. Then we have the left short gastric. Then we have the posterior gastric. And lastly, the pancreatic arteries. Pancreatic arteries are divided into the dorsal and the greater pancreatic arteries. So let us look at the exact arrangement that we saw earlier here in this 3D atlas. As you can see that this right here is the anatomy, the abdominal aorta. And through the abdominal aorta, we have the celiac trunk right here, and the three branches of the celiac trunk, namely the left gastric, that's here, right here. Then we have the tortuous splenic artery, and lastly, we have the common, the left short gastric artery. Is it the left short gastric? This branch is common hepatic artery. Sorry, it's a common hepatic artery. So left gastric, and then we have the splenic, and then the common hepatic artery. Okay, so right there I have isolated the branches of the splenic artery. As you can see, we have one branch right here, and then we have the second branch right here, and the third branch right here. So the first branch, let us observe the first branch. The first branch is also known as the short gastric arterial branch. Then we have the other branch known as the gastroemental branch right here. So this is the gastroemental, the short gastric, then the gastroemental, and lastly we have the pancreatic branch that goes and joins the tail, like, you know, we have the pancreas right here, so it goes and joins the pancreas. So gastroepiploic or gastroemental that goes downwards and joins the greater omentum. Then we have this short gastric that supplies the stomach, and lastly the pancreatic. Okay, so those were the branches of the gastric artery. Now let us take a look at the splenic artery, the branches of the splenic artery that also supply the stomach. So that's the splenic artery, the tortuous artery right here, and it is divided into three parts that supply majority of the superior posterior region of the stomach. So it's quite a bit of a mess here, but it is important to know that there are three main branches that are going to be coming off of the splenic artery.